Hello everyone, welcome back to SwitchUp. Let's take a look at Biomutant, shall we, in detail. Now I think to say this is good, bad and ugly is an accurate representation of what Saber have done with the Nintendo Switch port, and with that in mind we are going to concentrate first on performance, frame rates. We'll look at both docked and handheld modes, and I'll try and give you every little detail about the way that it's currently running on Nintendo Switch. If this is of any use to you at all, make sure you hit some buttons and tickle the algorithm, and also leave me a comment. Let me know if you've got any other questions. I'll try and answer those as quickly as I can. A thanks to the publisher for the review copy. Have the mutations taken this one too far? Well, my name's Mark Walker, welcome back to SwitchUp. Now let's find out. Let's start with some positives, shall we? In docked mode, the game is targeting 1080p and 30 frames per second. A big caveat to that is that it's using dynamic resolution scaling. In handheld mode, we're also looking at native resolution, so 720p, and running hopefully somewhere near 30 frames per second. Again, this uses dynamic resolution scaling, so that resolution can drop right down to try and facilitate smooth frame rates. When we actually take a look at the frame rates in docked, we can see that as long as there's not too much going on, it can actually maintain that, and also the frame pacing is sub around 35 milliseconds. When it's consistent, it feels actually very good, and the same can be said for handheld mode. Now, Biomutant is a massive game, and as such, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that has the potential to tax the CPU and GPU. With that in mind, whenever the game has to load, things like RAM speed become real factors, and you will see some momentary pauses while it tries to load in new assets. As well as that, if there's a lot going on screen or in certain areas of the map, that frame rate will drop right down. But when you're moving at speed, a combination of those two elements really can affect the frame rates. Watch how when I spawn my water vehicle, you'll see some real drops as I then try to move at speed to a new area. As we move between a number of different locations, you can see the impact this has on gameplay. While it's certainly a little inconsistent, as I say, for the vast majority of your time, it will actually maintain that 30 frames per second limit. The elephant in the room here, I think, which you're all probably saying in the comments already, is the visual quality. Now, Biomutant gained a bunch of attention to Experiment 101's game, probably because of its unique visual look. It looked absolutely stunning. There was dense grass. It had a unique character all of its own. And let's not forget the fur shaders. Your cute little mutant cat creature actually looked furry, and the closer you got to them, the more detail you could see on any of the other ones, including the mounts that you got. The lighting engine was also very solid. It has a day-night cycle, and the shadows cast across the land, it just looked very, very good back when it released on other platforms. Now, that's not to say that it didn't have its fair share of glitches, errors and jank, which we'll go into, but when we look at visual quality on the Nintendo Switch version, it's taken a huge hit. Firstly, textures. Texture resolution is unbelievably low in certain places. It's a little inconsistent as well. Sometimes you'll come across textures where it looks like the artist just didn't turn up to work on that day. And then at others, they'll load in normally, and this bears the hallmarks of many releases we've seen, where textures will stream in over time as you enter a new area. Rotating the camera will also see the after effects of a few other techniques where you can see that the game is primarily focusing on rendering what's in front of the camera, so that as you turn sharply, areas of nothingness will appear momentarily before then becoming their solid items. Texture resolution is bad in both docked and handheld modes, but the image quality issues don't stop there. Now, dynamic resolution scaling and some form of upscaling technology can lead to some serious artifacts, especially when you're using specific shaders like the fur shader. The cat's whiskers look quite unnerving on the Nintendo Switch version. It looks like something is trying to burst out of its face. There's simply not enough information for it to do anything. That same issue applies to things like rain and weather effects. I noticed in game that there were strange flashing lights happening every few minutes. Turned the volume up and realised that actually it's supposed to be torrential rain, but I don't think there's enough information to actually render any rain droplets. If you look down at the ground, sure enough you can actually see the little splashes, but to my eyes I couldn't see them anywhere else. Saber have put in the ability to change the amount of sharpening to try and get it looking a little nicer, but it's the lighting engine as well that's taken quite a significant hit. Now I mentioned that it has a day-night cycle. If my memory serves correctly, this was actually a smooth transition back on other platforms, but here if you stand still, the shadows will stutter their way along the ground as the sun moves across the sky. I think it's a testament to the game though, that despite all of these issues, there are still a few times when it can actually look quite pretty, or at least not so grim. Take this sequence where I got back in the mech in handheld mode, and despite a few frame rate stutters when I made my way to the next open area, it holds up quite well. I think that's one of Biomutant's biggest credits, and it's the diversity in terms of the artwork of the massive map that you've got on offer here. There aren't many areas that don't have things that are entirely unique. I mentioned to Glen that it feels like the artists, developers, and everyone that worked on the game thought to themselves, what could we include next? And the answer was just yes. That goes for mechanics as well, as we'll get into. Still, as we can see though, frame rates and visual quality on the Nintendo Switch version, they are, well, the Nintendo Switch version. It also uses a real-time map that had a lot of the lighting and shadow effects still in it. And on Switch, the blur is most certainly real when you're navigating that. It can be slightly detrimental to your navigation ability because things like the fast travel points become a little harder to see. It's at this point that I would like to say that we've already heard from the developer, Saber, that there's a day one patch arriving that is supposed to improve performance, fix some of the bugs, and polish up some of what hopefully you're seeing here. Now with that said, that's not the build that we've got, or at least as far as my knowledge, this is 1.0, but as you know on the channel we revisit games. So the next all patched up, which is actually later this week or next, you'll be able to see exactly what they did, or not, as the case may be. The world of Biomutant is filled with, mutants, different creatures, both friendly and foe, and it's another mixed bag as far as character models go. The animations of these seems to have taken a slight hit, or it could just be that frame rate inconsistency making it feel even more clunky. It's important to note this isn't a AAA game, and as such, you do expect a certain level of jank. But just check out the swimming animations. I think ironically, the non-swimming, as it's called, is one of the more comical janky animations. Level of detail draw distance has some unusual quirks. Some of the key items in the world will disappear from only a few meters away. In fact, entire doors can disappear from existence, making you think that they're open doorways. You move towards them and there's nothing there. The shrubbery and environmental foliage, that also does not look good on Switch. And don't get me started on water quality and effects. Let's head to sound and audio then. Now Biomutant has a fantastic soundtrack, it's surprisingly good. It has sweeping orchestral scores and taps into the Orient in some of its styling. And musically it still sounds great on Nintendo Switch. Sound effects, not so much. There seems to be a slight issue with spatial sound. You can be very far away from an enemy fight, and it sounds like it's right there next to you. There were some times when I was navigating the world where I thought I'd come under attack. It sounded like bullets were flying all over the place, but actually the fight was about half a mile away. When they're working though, they're actually not bad. And ironically, when you're up close and personal in a fight, it can actually be the opposite way, as if someone's stolen some of the sound effects. Much of the game is voice acted, and that comes in the form of a narrator. This next point is very much a personal thing. If you find that you don't like the narrator's voice, or it just grates on you, or it reminds you of that guy that narrates In the Night Garden, which you had to watch constantly when you had younger kids, and now it does your head in, you can actually tailor the amount of narration you have in game. There's a slightly unusual thing here where the narrator actually interprets all of the characters' gobbledygook language for you, but it's just a bit strange. I would have preferred that they say their dialogue in their gobbledygook language and it was written in a normal way and you just read it. See what you think.
He says that wasn't too bad, was it? At least you learned that you'll drown if you don't swim.
Iggle piggle.
Image quality has to take a massive hit. Performance overall is okay, but still this is definitely, as I say, the Switch version. Visuals and performance, they score 11 out of 20. Sound and audio together scores 14 out of 20. Now then we get onto the massive subject of story, gameplay and controls. Before anything, you can create your own character, choosing from a number of different archetypes, and then customizing the color, and you make an early decision about whether you're a good or bad character. These are indicated with a light and dark creature, your conscience if you will, and actions in these different areas will push you in one or the other direction, giving me Knights of the Old Republic vibes. However, the voice actor of the light side does my head in slightly, I've got to be honest.
And you're always trying to pretend it's not.
It's a multi-part story with branching paths, the overarching one being that the Toxinol Corporation caused an environmental disaster, which meant that the Earth was poisoned, humanity left, and all living creatures mutated and evolved. What remains are tribal conflicts between these factions. Oh, and the world is going to end, and that's probably the most interesting aspect because your actions can actually change the outcome. In the center of the map is the huge Tree of Life, giving me Elden Ring vibes, and it's suffering itself. When it comes to gameplay, you're looking at a vast open world RPG that takes place from the third person with a kung fu system as well as ranged weaponry, an insane number of different systems and mechanics, and the ability to go absolutely anywhere and do anything. You don't take any fall damage when you plummet from a great height, and the land is filled with multiple different tribes. You can move around freely and visit these, joining their faction or fighting against them, and by doing so, you'll unlock not only unique weapons, items and gear, but different quest lines, shops, vendors, and even outposts which you can help to overrun. The more you help a particular tribe, the more they'll also in turn help you, and some of those unique weapons, they're hugely powerful. That's probably a good time to talk about the third-person combat. Now, the developer here have actually included gyroscopic controls for the guns. As you can see, those actually handle remarkably well. Pulling the trigger on your pistol with ZR engages the gyroscope. Now you can tweak this to however you like it, but it works surprisingly well, even when the frame rate can be a little more inconsistent. Alongside this, you have your Kung Fu. Known here as Wong Fu, you learn new moves from different masters, there's a block and counter system, and later you'll discover more powerful Wong Fu techniques. But even with its lock-on, it can feel a little clunky. It certainly improves as you go on because there are so many different weapons and ways of using them as you gain skill points and upgrade your character. Now the skill tree is pretty simple. Well, the first one is. Then you've got the Wong Fu skills, the mutation abilities, the psi powers. You see where we're going. There are layers upon layers of upgrade that you can do to your character. When I first started Biomutant, I think for the first 10 hours, I wasn't really enjoying it. In fact, I could really sympathize with the many players who say, I tried to play the game and it just didn't click with me. But there is something here. There's a level of freedom, for example, that I haven't seen in any game. There's also a lack of hand-holding, which I really appreciate. And although it is essentially bloated with its systems, once you get to grips with them, there's a sense of exploration, not only in its mechanics, but also in its world, which can lead to some real enjoyment. Take the mount system. Feeding different creatures a certain type of berry will actually allow you to mount them. You can then spawn these mounts wherever you want. But later, as I say, you get mechs. There's a glider in here like Breath of the Wild. And there are massively toxic areas which you'll need to have the right gear to be able to survive in. And this is definitely one for the loot fans. As a huge Fallout fan, I have an issue whereby if there's loot in a game and it's varied and enjoyable, it can take me out of the main experience for hours on end. Biomutant does that brilliantly. You might come across a cave, spend 2 or 3 hours clearing it out, gathering up all the loot, selling in shops, and on that note, there's a currency and fluctuation system here underneath, meaning that you can find stuff quite cheaply, sell it higher in another region, and make a good amount of bunts. The loot is also graded with different rarities, but if you find something you don't like, you can strip it down for parts, and then comes in the crafting system. Crafting is brilliant here. You can make weapons from scratch, tinkering together different components, or visiting one of the crafting benches which are suspended below hot air balloons, top tip, and further upgrading and changing what you've got. Aside from usable loot, you've also got wearable items, such as the glorious duck head helmet you've probably seen in a lot of this footage. It's not necessarily the type of stuff I expected to see, but it is a play on the idea that humanity's left a lot of its trash behind, and the mutants have taken that and used it. It wouldn't be an open world RPG worth its salt without a bunch of side quests, and there are hundreds here. They range from standard fetch quests, but there are a number that are far more intricate than I expected. Some of the main storytelling is really quite bad, with dialogue that feels disjointed. But still, the overarching story it tells is definitely worth your time, and the ability to change some of the outcomes and the decisions you make with who you decide to side with, they add a certain something that I don't think I've seen since maybe the game Pine on Switch. I want to finish the gameplay and control section by talking about jankiness. It's something we hear thrown around a lot, but there's a lot of it here. You might be having a fight and an enemy will just stop moving. You yourself might get stuck in an animation and just be floating in the sky for a brief while. With so many different systems at play, it's inevitable that there's gonna be some level of glitchiness. And I think with Biomutant, even since its launch, that has been the case. The presentation on Switch only emphasizes some of those. If you can look past all of that, and its core tenets of freedom and choice appeal to you, then there's definitely enjoyment to be had here. But for some, I think a combination of the visual presentation and those elements may put them off. With all things on balance, for me, gameplay scores 14 out of 20. It's great to see them implement gyroscopic controls, but a combination of other elements and the camera sometimes getting blocked can make this feel a little more difficult than it should. Those also score 14 out of 20. Biomutant has a physical edition, which is great, and it launches with the price of £34.99. This includes the free Mercenary Loadout DLC, and it can be beaten in around 13 hours. With that said, for completionists, you're going to push it way further than that, but for 35 quid, I think it's quite expensive, particularly with the way it looks comparative to every other platform. Value scores 13 out of 20. I personally like Biomutant much more than its score might indicate, but giving a fair reflection of all the elements is really important. Overall then it gets a SwitchUp score of 66%. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. I can certainly see why this has a real fan following. There are some great elements here, but the jank, yeah, it's unavoidable. Thanks to our Patreons and members, all of you that enjoy the content, and as always for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!